Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back from summer. Looks like we have a great crowd for one of my favorite events I think we've ever hosted here at the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here and Atlantic Council Vice President. And I wanted to just start us off briefly and extend a warm welcome to all of today's speakers. You'll hear more about them in a second from our moderator. I'm also very excited to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guests in the audience, including UAE Ambassador Yusuf Al Otaiba and Her Excellency Noura Al-Kabi, I think who will be coming soon. She's the UAE Minister of State for Federal National Council Affairs and Chair of the Media Zone Authority in Abu Dhabi, along with several other officials from the UAE Embassy and other distinguished guests. In a few moments, when I invite our panelists to the stage, they'll engage in a discussion of the challenges and opportunities facing youth in the Middle East and how states can engage. Hello, Madam Minister. Nice to see you again. I just introduced you. It was a rousing introduction. Facing youth in the Middle East and how states can engage their youth populations to build a more positive and hopeful future. Remember that phrase in a second. Everyone today works closely, everyone you'll see today on stage works closely with dynamic young leaders and entrepreneurs across the region in the fields of education, employment, technology, environmental activism, and much, much more. To moderate this important conversation, we're really privileged to have with us our friend of the council, Kim Gaddis, BBC journalist and author of The Secretary, a journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the heart of American power. Kim currently covers international affairs and the Clinton presidential campaign and brings to the conversation many years of experience on and in the Middle East. She'll lead our expert panelists in a conversation on the challenges of the region, the vitality of its youth population, and the options for engaging and empowering Middle Eastern youth. Before I hand it over to Kim, I'm also particularly delighted to welcome Her Excellency Shama Al-Mazroui, for what is her first public speaking engagement in the United States since she became the youngest minister in the world in any government in February as the UAE's Minister of State for Youth Affairs. In her short tenure as minister thus far, she has set up a system of local youth councils. She's very invested in developing youth projects and promoting entrepreneurship as a way to invest in and empower UAE youth. Before her appointment as minister, she graduated from New York University, Abu Dhabi, and was later the first UAE student awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to attend Oxford, where she completed a master's degree in public diplomacy. The issues at play in this discussion today could not be more important. Next generation leadership, demography, economic opportunity, innovation. They're of particular interest to us at the Council as they affect, in a very important and underappreciated way, Middle East security and stability, and thereby the security and stability of multiple regions as we see the crisis from the region playing out across the globe in many damaging ways. These types of questions, security, prosperity, the role of youth in the broader Middle East, are not just crucial to U.S. national interests, but the Council here is tackling these in a big way. I'm leaving this meeting to go to a meeting with Steve Hadley and Madeleine Albright, where we are working vigorously on a very novel strategy for the Middle East under the auspices of the Hariri Center here at the Atlantic Council, where this set of issues will play a very prominent and important role. So stay tuned for the release of those two co-chairs' final report later this fall. We also have here at the Atlantic Council an entire center devoted to these types of efforts. It's called the Millennial Leadership Program, and it's our hub for engaging young leaders as we seek to foster, connect, and empower the next generation of global leaders seeking positive impact in the world. I've already talked too long, but I'm so excited about this, I had to get all that out. And now I'll turn the stage over to the capable hands of Kim. Please follow along with this event on Twitter using the hashtag ACMidEast and from the account @ACScowcroft. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to moderate this event here at the Atlantic Council this afternoon. a wonderful conversation about Arab youth and their potential in the region with Her Excellency Minister Shamma Suhail Al-Mazroui, the Minister of State for Youth Affairs for the UAE, and our excellent panel. Their full bios are in the program, but I will introduce them very briefly. We have, first of all, William Rees, President and CEO of the International Youth Foundation, which works in many experiments. Uprisings. Young revolution have been beaten down, ended up in a dead into the around 60% of the population is under 30. So that's a lot of jobs that need to be risen even further from what was already quite a high percentage before the uprising to a regional average of 30%. The drop in oil prices has further weakened economic growth. Young people are still excluded from public life. We have not really seen a young generation of politicians or government officials rise, with a few exceptions, like the minister herself. And of course, we have wars, refugees, and extremism, which combined make for long-term instability and a lost generation. From job creation to better life skills, to access to policymakers for young people, and to what people in the policy world call countering violent extremism. The challenges are huge, as are the opportunities. And that's what we will try to unpack this afternoon here during this conversation. I want to start by giving the minister the opportunity for some brief opening remarks, after which I will draw all our panelists into a conversation for about 45 minutes. And after that, we'll have the opportunity for questions from the audience. So, Minister Shamma Al-Mazroui, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a privilege and honor to be here, and I want to thank the entire Atlantic Council team for including me in this important discussion. I know we're all here to talk about youth, but I want to talk about physics. It's the law of physics that in a vacuum in nature cannot exist. Empty spaces in nature are unnatural. Something must fill them. It's also a law of physics that energy in any form will follow the path of least resistance. And I think these are the laws that are governing the growing youth bulge in the Middle East. And it's these laws that affect us all. Basically, what does that mean? If there's a gap between government leadership and their youth, if governments do not value their youth sufficiently and therefore are not connected to their true needs, ideas, and concerns, if governments don't create authentic, credible channels to connect to their youth, what happens? This creates a social vacuum of unempowered youth who will follow different paths. Some of these paths we cannot even imagine or we don't want to anticipate. And some of these paths we can't afford. And youth energy will take these paths or take other forms. And just like you, I find it terrifying that some youth can be swayed by watching the wrong YouTube video or following the wrong Twitter page, forever misshaping the course of so many lives. And we've seen this. Hopelessness results when youth are not employed. Apathy results when youth are not seen as assets. Violence results when youth are not valued. Youth are such a powerful energy. We're growing rapidly. We're filled with skills, ideas, and we have a restless quest for purpose. I want to share with you a story that some of you may know. It's a story about how my country, the United Arab Emirates, is investing in its youth to create a new vision of hope, openness, and opportunity in the Middle East. How the UAE is filling these vacuums by investing in us, in what will make us as youth prosper. And how the UAE is fighting for the future, because the future is youth. It's a fight for jobs, for opportunities, for purpose, for unity and tolerance. And many view youth or view us as a threat or danger, but our UAE leadership has long seen youth as an irreplaceable asset, as the key to our country's growth. I'm a testament of my country's commitment and courage to go beyond rhetoric and thoroughly integrate youth into the process of building our future. Our Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, has appointed a cabinet of ministers, many of whom are below the age of 37 years old, and who are responding to this charge. Our leadership's vision is to empower youth to be their best, no matter what field of work they pursue. And to get these things done, I have made it my business to engage with youth, to empower them. And I'm pushing the public sector and the private sector to make it their business to engage with youth. Now, not tomorrow. And it's my hope that this UAE model that we've just started can inspire the region, because we're taking deliberate and mindful action. And I'll just give you one example. We started a platform called Youth Circles, where youth across several emirates, across the 7 emirates that we have, can share their ideas, their thoughts, their concerns directly with ministers of government. It is beautiful to see firsthand the power of our youth having an unprecedented opportunity to shape their own future. Let me emphasize this innovative form of youth engagement. Imagine this accessibility, the ability to break through barriers and empower youth to shape their future. I'm personally filled with hope in this new chapter that we've begun writing in the UAE, where we're positioning youth as key authors and of their future.
Profile positions in the Arab world. And do you, I'll challenge you just a little bit, do you feel empowered, or do you worry that perhaps it was just a token gesture? This is what some people will be asking you.
So just to go to your question on the token gesture, in the UAE, we don't have time for publicity stunts. I'm blessed, I think we're blessed to come from a country that does not want to wait, it wants to take action now. So we can't wait to develop the best youth strategy. We have to implement something now. And that's to me, empowerment, to try to take risks, calculated risks, in investing in our youth.
And why do you think it's important to have young people in positions like the one that you are in?
Because young people, not only are they filled with a lot of talent and energy, but they bring fresh insight that another person might not see. And when you have policies that serve young people, I come from a country where more than 50% of our population are youth, and our government takes this very seriously. And it's important that we understand, we need to be in their shoes, we need to know how they feel, instead of giving them policies over them, not by them and from them.
So in other words, you are able to relate to the issues that young people actually are concerned about and translate that into government policy.
Yes.
Are you planning perhaps to travel around the region at some point as well, or will you be focused mostly first on the UAE? What can you learn from the rest of the region, and what have you learned from your trip to the US?
So I'm currently in my first year, and we're focusing a lot domestically. But I care a lot about my region. I care a lot about my peers around in the MENA region, and I'm here in the U.S. to meet a lot of youth organizations to know about. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of organizations here that have done massive and amazing youth work. One of them, the International Youth Foundation, and what William's doing here. And so I'm here to know about things that we can, possible potential partnerships that we can do.
The UAE is quite special in the region in the sense that in a recent survey, it tops the list of countries that young people from other Arab countries would like to live in, and the one that they think their own country should emulate. But of course, the UAE is a bit of a standout in that sense. Youth unemployment in the UAE is low compared to the rest of the region, closer to the world average, around 10%, as opposed to 40% in Egypt. I understand, of course, that you are focused on the UAE, on your peers, on youth in your own country. But what do you think you set as an example for the rest of the region, being in the position that you are in? Do you think any of your experiences you could translate later on to inspire others in the region?
I think you raise a very nice point, because yesterday I was at a dinner and I had to give a speech, and at the end of the dinner the waiter grabbed my arm and told me, my daughter, he was Moroccan, and he was like, my daughter studies at a community college in Maryland, and she's 19 years old, and she finds you an inspiration, and she hopes that back home she can do something and she can be empowered in whatever field she wants to pursue.
Jasmine, I want to draw you in to this conversation next. As the minister mentioned, Arab youth are often seen as a burden because of the demographic bulge. Sometimes they're seen as a threat by some Arab governments rather than a potential. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the Arab world. I know you go back very often, and how do you think we can change that attitude?
Thank you. Those are really good questions, and thank you for your remarks. I think you're an incredible inspiration to youth in the region, so thank you for that. I do want to make a note, just to start, and this is kind of an obvious point, but I feel like it should be mentioned right at the top, is that when we talk about the region, it's very different.
There's a lot of diversity.
Region, there's a lot of diversity, and there are just, the UAE is such an incredible example of hope and prosperity and opportunity, but it's also much smaller and has not necessarily gone through the same difficulties that other countries have gone through in the last few years, such as Egypt and Jordan, certainly Syria, Libya, Tunisia, and other such countries. So I think I would be interested in drawing out some of the differences in terms of the contextual differences between the different countries and what kinds of opportunities fit in those different contexts. So my experience has been obviously mostly in Egypt. I grew up in Egypt, as you mentioned, or I think Barry mentioned earlier. Do we have any Egyptians in the house? I saw some that I recognized. So I think it's important to talk about education first, just as a sort of building block, right? So I grew up in Egypt, and education back then was just very much focused on memorization. It wasn't so much of a discussion as it was, here are some facts that we would like you to memorize, like the sky is blue, we have the best sense of humor, and Hosni Mubarak is president. Done. Like, those are just, 2 out of those, by the way, are true today. But you had this generation that was used to memorizing, and that was used to being told certain things and not really taught to question them, certainly not in terms of who our leadership was or who, Egypt's leaders were. That same generation was the generation that effected not only a change, but one of the biggest, most previously unheard of changes in the world, or at least certainly in the Arab world, and that was the revolution in 2011. So I want to just say 2 quick things about that, just to your question about opportunities and possibilities. that generation that found itself involved in this incredible revolution, it was such a high. It was such a feeling of individual empowerment and hope and possibility and all of these positive things. But it's almost like you got to the finish line and then you realized that you didn't have anything to go any further. So, you know, the revolution happened, and then the follow-up was impossible because they didn't have the tools to, you know, to build on the progress that they had made. And that goes back to the way the education system was set up. On the other, so that's sort of something, an opportunity. It was a missed opportunity, but it's something to learn from in the future in terms of the current generation that's growing up in the Middle East. The positive aspect of that is that along with this on-the-ground revolution that was happening, there was a social media revolution that was happening at the same time. And you had this generation that suddenly, I was talking to one of my friends just yesterday about this, and he said they had this moment where you realized that you were suddenly one click away from telling the entire world anything that you wanted to tell them. And to bring them along with you on the journey and to include them in this conversation and to include them in this experience. And so the social media aspect of it inspired a new generation of entrepreneurs. And it provided a way to harness some of that energy that came out of the revolution. If the government itself couldn't harness it on the ground, then certainly the youth in Egypt could take it into their own hands and use it to connect with other audiences. And I think that provides an incredible opportunity that we could focus on.
You speak about the gap between skills and potential, the gap between the education sector and the market needs. And I want to join Matthias in Bill, because those are some of the more, let's say, technical aspects of the issue that need to be addressed to be able to bridge that gap, whether it's updating skills or whether it's finding ways to expand the job market. When you look at the region, Bill, and you've worked around the world, and Matthias as well, if you could pitch in, you know, what differences and what similarities do you see with the rest of the world? Obviously, within the Arab world itself, there are, you know, every country has its own specificities, but there are some things in common. You know, youth want pretty much the same thing almost everywhere. And so what are the similarities and what are the differences that are specific to the Arab world that need to be addressed when it comes to skills, to education, to public-private partnership? I know, Matthias, you've also worked on national service models in Lebanon. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you think on that?
Well, good. Well, Jasmine has reminded us that the MENA region itself is pretty darn diverse. And then you go to the whole globe, and of course you have diversity. But getting young people connected, having no gap to their society, their government, and frankly the market, is an aspiration that all countries need to be. The United States, the richest countries in Europe are concerned about where their children or grandchildren, what kind of jobs they'll have in 2030, 2050, 2060. Those 2030 goals can seem a long way off. But a 15-year-old today will be 30 years old in 2030. And she and he had better have jobs and a place in the economy and a place in society, or else this demographic will become a challenge, if not a crisis, and not an asset as it should be seen. Because there could be a tremendous demographic bonus if, in the Matthias, and we had a small hand in working with the team that developed the 2007 World Development Report. Youth is a transition. It's not an end in itself. Youth is something between childhood and adulthood, as the report talks about. And it's 9 years old now, but it's still very relevant. So if you haven't looked at it, and you can read the 48-page summary and not the 500-page full report and get most of it. But it really should be dog-eared at this point by anyone who's interested in not just youth, but economic and political development in countries. Because to not take into account the young people, 70% of most of these countries are under 30. So that's 30-some%, or between 15 and 30. They are assets today. They're not just tomorrow's leaders, but how to make them so. There is a skills mismatch, and sometimes it's bad education or old education. or traditional education. Critical thinking, which would be the flip side of memorization, is something people talk about in much of the world. Life skills was a difficult concept for people to grasp 10, 15 years ago, but it's not today and hasn't been for quite a while. They may call it different things: soft skills, employability skills, life skills, problem-solving skills, but employers will say oftentimes that that's what's missing in young people. It's not the technical degree. Yet in Egypt, where you've lived, there are more college graduates that are unemployed than high school graduates. And that's devastating, I think, for a young person. It's also, I think, perverse for a country. Think how much money went into educating those people and could be spent in different ways at different levels of education to see that all high school and college graduates have a chance to find a place in the economy. We want young people to end up being taxpayers, for Pete's sake, and not live on the margins, because if they aren't, then the countries won't be sustainable and viable. So life skills are terribly important. How do you teach those things? Well, not online, but there are some digitalized ways you could reach out and reach larger audiences. I don't think be taught in a classroom either very easily by memorizing something, although lectures and how-to sessions can work. But life skills are taught in apprenticeships, internships, after-school activities, community activities. But a lot of kids grow up in communities where there isn't what we might think of as the civil society or the Little League and the Girl Scouts and church and mosque and synagogue programs that do after school and preschool and community service. Those things can sound awfully soft, but that's where a lot of young people learn how to work in groups, how to take orders and give orders if you're working together on a community service opportunity. Those are skills that kids get from that they take into parenting and into their roles as citizens, hopefully, and then, of course, into their life. Do you want to be hiring people for your organizations, even a think tank like this, who aren't entrepreneurial, who aren't risk takers? So I don't want to marginalize or monopolize entrepreneurship for would-be entrepreneurs who's going to start a business someday. We all need to be critical thinkers and imaginative and creative. I don't want to hire people at my foundation who can't think out of the box or push an envelope, although I've never quite understood what pushing an envelope meant, but maybe that's my lack of creativity. But these are huge issues, and the good thing, I think, the good news is that we see high schools, TVET or vocational ed systems, public and private, throughout the region, community colleges, four-year universities, all taking in different types of life skills and career counseling and career visioning into their programs. And we've worked at these different levels. Now, we always work through partnerships with indigenous organizations. Our foundation doesn't go out and deliver a program in anyone else's country. We would be working with NGOs or colleges or TVET systems. And frankly, the governments have to be involved. Public-private partnerships are not just something you cobble together overnight. It does mean the civil society groups, domestic and international, and business, big multinationals as well as local businesses, have to have a relationship with government, and that relationship needs to go both ways, or else a true public-private partnership isn't going to be more than maybe a cute little demonstration project. But long-term sustainability requires that education meets a market demand, not what we think as planners that kids ought to learn. It has to serve market needs in some fashion.
And how responsive have you found Arab governments in the countries that you do work in to those ideas? And Matthias, then I want to draw you in on the differences that I know you've pointed out with the rest of the world.
Well, as you've already said, there are a diversity of governments, and some of them run there and name their ministers in a different way. We could learn from that in the United States, but we don't even have a Ministry of Youth. That's maybe something we should think about here.
There you go.
But
the Arab world inspiring the United States.
Well,
why not?
Yes, but some of the Arab governments aren't as functional as others. And some governments don't reach out well and communicate well with their private sector, or the private sector may not trust the government. There's got to be a dialogue. There's got to be a relationship. If businesses and your education systems are going to raise and educate and build those skills that the market's going to need. Some of it we can't even predict what jobs are going to be needed in 2030 or 2040. And some of us are old enough that doesn't matter. But it certainly does matter to a 15-year-old today who will only be 40 years old in 2040? And what if that economy is losing jobs rather than gaining jobs? So it's a huge, and that's a global challenge too, because frankly, your countries are related to the rest of the world economically. We all fly through the biggest hub in the world now.
Let me join Matthias, and then I'll come back to you, Jasmine, because I want to hear from you a little bit about your work in the region and the barriers that you have found also within, from outside to inside the Arab world, but also within the Arab world between the different sectors and officialdom and the people.
So let me pick up first on a few things that Bill has said just now. There are some countries which have a 70% youth population, and I go and talk to ministers of youth and others who say, we have a youth problem. And no, they don't have a youth problem. They have a national problem. This isn't a youth problem. There is a tendency to try to compartmentalize or isolate or be dismissive or provide token or limited programs to mollify youth and to deal with what frightens them immediately in the short run, that otherwise young people might be violent or might overthrow governments, which we know they can. Yeah. And we should all be aware of that. But that's not really why we need to pay attention. Why we need to pay attention is what Bill said, that by 2030, today's 16-year-old is going to be 30, and she's going to be the one driving global growth. It's not us. It's not those of us in this room. It'll be the 16-year-old whom we are more likely to be dismissive of today and not pay attention to today. So she's the one really we need to pay attention to. But getting back to some of your questions, so the skills problem, I think, is important. That when we talk to employers in the region, they say, yeah, we can find workers who are skilled. We can find workers who have the technical skills. We can't hire them because they haven't got the soft skills, the interpersonal skills, the life skills, whatever you want to call it, the dealing with clients and customers skills, the dealing with problems skills. They don't have those sorts of experiences. They've never had the opportunity to develop those experiences. The education system, as Bill said, is rather conventional, and as Jasmine said, is rather conventional and old-fashioned, and there are fewer opportunities to develop those talents in the region. And that's it's more true, it's more prevalent when we talk to employers in the Middle East and North Africa region. Of course, there are differences across the region than in other parts of the world. It's certainly true that this is more of a problem. But it also raises a question. We have to think about why it is that we have such a relatively highly educated population and a considerably larger unemployment rate in the region than elsewhere. And I think we need to step back a little bit and not think about what are the problems with the worker. We don't want to sort of put all of the fault. It's not all the fault of the young person who's trying to get into the labor market. One of the problems with the Middle East and North Africa region, again, sort of ignoring the differences within the region, are that firms are older and firm managers are older than anywhere else in the world. Policies and laws are generally established to protect firms, existing firms, in existing markets.
In other words, the status quo.
The status quo. So it's much more difficult for a young, ambitious person to break in, to begin a business, to establish himself or herself in the Middle East and North Africa region than elsewhere. It really is a problem of insiders and outsiders. Access to finance, access to other kinds of business inputs, access to training and other sorts of things. Much, much harder in the region than elsewhere in the world. And I think that, so we have to step back a little bit and not put all of the blame for unemployment on the individual who's unemployed. We have to think a little bit more about what policies might be necessary to expand opportunities for all.
Jasmine, you wanted to make a point about...
Yeah, I did. I wanted to make a point about just the trade-off that a lot of these, not the GCC countries necessarily, but the other countries, that they find themselves struggling with. Speaking of assigning blame, I also don't think that we should be too quick to blame the governments of these countries for not providing certain opportunities, because they're struggling with this trade-off between security, and education and the other soft skills that you're talking about, which are very important. But if you don't have a secure country, if you can't walk down the street without being kidnapped, if you can't sit in a cafe without having to worry about a car bomb, how do you really fully invest in things like education and employment? Shouldn't you fix that first? So, I was recently in Egypt and I was talking to a few government officials about the way that they see, like, what are your most pressing challenges today? And they get it. They get the fact that youth is important. They get the fact that employment is important. But in their mind, they have a security problem. They have to fix it. So there's an entrepreneurial summit that's being held in downtown Cairo in December. It's called Rise Up 16. And I think it's fantastic and it's really exciting. And it brings entrepreneurs from all over the world to Cairo to talk about ideas and exchange presentations. You can't do something like that if you don't have a conducive security environment. So in a way, maybe the Egyptians are right to focus on that first, but maybe they're not. So I just feel I would like to hear from the other panelists as we're talking about these recommendations to take into account this always, shifting balance of the scale between security and opportunity.
But that's been an issue in the Middle East for the longest time, right? That, what comes first? Is it stability? Mm-hmm. Is it freedom or democracy, whatever you want to call it? Is it jobs? Should we invest in the defense industry because, some countries are still at war with Israel, etc. So those are the balance, this is what every country has to balance. But I assume that you can't prioritize one over the other because there just isn't time. As the minister said, there is no time to look at the best way forward. You have to start implementing something now, right?
I completely agree with that, and I agree that there's so many different challenges in different countries in the MENA region. But solutions to these challenges, or even prioritizing them, it's important to listen to youth and see what's important to them, what keeps them awake at night. And so going back to how we're doing it in the UAE, to find solutions to challenges, we don't just come up with a solution, it comes from youth. So in a few weeks, we're going to launch our national youth strategy, and it comes from our youth councils. They're the ones who are drafting their own youth strategy. I don't think so. I've seen that around the world where youth themselves are the ones who are finding their own solutions to whatever challenges they face.
I don't know how far you are in some of those projects and the youth circles, but can you give us a few more examples about how you intend to, in a concrete way, translate that hope and those aspirations into effective mechanisms or projects? Because yes, I think we all agree that we need to inspire and empower young people, but it takes very specific programs to do that.
I'll give you an example. So we had a youth circle in Ramadan a couple of weeks ago, and it was on entrepreneurship and what challenges Emiratis who are in a small emirate, some of you may know, called Ajman. And so youth were sitting with government officials from Ajman trying to understand what are the challenges they face. How can they reach their aspiration to be the best entrepreneurs? And after discussing a lot of macro and micro level details on bankruptcy laws and the ecosystem and incubators, we realized that Emiratis in Ajman do not have an incubator. Emiratis in Abu Dhabi do. In Dubai they do, but in Ajman they don't. And the government word trickled up, and now in September we're going to launch an incubator in Ajman. That's the way. We're not going to wait to develop the best incubator, but we want to try now. We want to test it. We want to take risks. We want to take action and listen to youth. I think that's very important.
And listening to youth is, of course, very important. It's something that not all governments know how to do in the region. Jasmine, I want to circle back to my question from the beginning. How do we change? I mean, I don't expect you to have the answer. Otherwise, you could be running, a country in the Arab world. But how do you think we can start changing the attitude of some Arab governments, when it comes to young people? As Matthias was also pointing out, is it a potential or is it a burden? Is it just a specific issue? A lot of governments, as he pointed out, see it as a specific issue in time. How do you mollify them today so they don't become violent? That's a lot of, that's often how some governments look at young people. How do we change that attitude? And does it come from the government? Does it come from young people?
Wow, it's a great question. I think, obviously it's both an opportunity and a burden. When you have an entire population that is excited and they want to do something and they have these tools just within reach, and social media allows them to see how other youth are are being integrated into their societies and as solutions into their societies and other countries. It's an opportunity. It's a burden in the sense that if the youth become too frustrated and you don't have opportunities for them to channel that energy, then it could turn against you. I was talking to a friend yesterday about this. He's Egyptian American as well, and he was kind of trying to put himself in the shoes of Egyptian youth. And you've had sort of two revolutions in the last 5 years. One was overthrowing a dictatorship, essentially. And that didn't really bring about the change that they were hoping for. Then you had a democratically elected president. That didn't really bring the change that they were looking for. So there was another revolution. And so here you are sitting in Egypt thinking, okay, well, this didn't work and that didn't work. So what is the answer? And that's when you start to worry about them turning to violence. Maybe, that's when that message of, well, violence is the answer. That's what I've been telling you all along. What the minister was saying about the wrong YouTube videos and the wrong messages, that's when you really start to get into the danger of that. The way to, I think, turn it into an opportunity, and I realize this is much easier said than done, but I think that this is at least the way to start thinking about it, is exactly what the minister has said about having this be a conversation, listening to the youth populations in your country, trying to get a sense of what it is that they want. How do they see themselves? What kind of solutions do they have? I mean, they're much more creative, maybe than their older counterparts. I think that's fair to say. So maybe try to get some of the answers from them and see what they're doing on their own. I mean, there are several individual-led projects out there. There's a project called Tayyara in Egypt. It's a creative production media hub that does original content to inspire and educate, hopefully, others in the region. I think it's Tayyara World. You can look them up. So you can take some of the things that are happening by virtue of individual initiative and maybe try to see how you can scale that up. Maybe take experiences from other governments that have had more of an opportunity to engage with their youth and think about how you can apply those to your country and scale them up to your population and fit them within your context.
Because particularly in Egypt, we've seen several rounds of revolutions and counter-revolutions, and young activists of all different stripes and colors being chucked in jail. That makes the conversation very difficult between young people and the government. So is the solution then, Bill and Matthias, to have youth evolve on a separate track where they involve, they engage in entrepreneurship, in private sector development separately from whatever their government is doing? I mean, that makes it very difficult because you need to operate in an environment where the laws, where the education helps to make this move forward.
And don't forget the expats too, just, because that's a big element of the equation.
Look, the governments are going to have to do more than one thing at a time. Even if you're only trying to tackle employment for young people, is that the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Hospitality? And hospitality employs about 10% of the workforce of the world. Is it the Agricultural Ministry if you're trying to develop rural areas? So it will require, frankly, more than the Ministry of Youth or the Ministry of Education to get anything done that will be sustainable and broad-based. The discussion of security and whatever else the other side of the coin would be, peace, growth. I mean, capital, of course, is a coward. So investments won't come to unstable, risky environments. So there has to be security on the streets, but there won't be enough money to pay the police if you don't employ enough people. I think we tend to want silver bullets, and a silver bullet is fine if you're developing a vaccine for a certain disease. Go into the laboratory, find that vaccine, and come out and apply it. Economic growth, long-term inclusive, broad-based economic growth is a problem in Spain or the United States or Germany and all the other countries that aren't quite as well developed. Look at Spain, was an economic miracle. 20, 25 years ago, and now it's got 40% unemployment. That just didn't happen overnight, but this is not a problem like malaria or the PEPFAR program with HIV that maybe can be solved if enough ARVs can get out there. This is going to be a challenge for economies forever, and they have to be peaceful, reasonable communities for people to get to work and people to invest in. The schools have got to work, but it's going to take policies. It's going to take the private sector. There are no quickies in this business.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the programs that your organization has, including especially in the MENA region, those life skills that you mentioned earlier on?
Well, we have developed, and this isn't a silver bullet either. There are a lot of organizations that are out there dealing with life skill programs. We happen to think that ours is a pretty good one. It's about 15 years old, and it was started in Mexico and India to keep kids in high school from dropping out. And over time, we have scaled that and adapted it to use in 40-some countries, 20 languages, different levels of education. In Egypt, we took it to the first ever career counseling centers that were set up by some of Egypt's largest universities, whose kids were graduating and couldn't find a job and didn't know how to get a job. So actually the life skills were used now for college graduates, not just kids in school. But we try very hard to pull the private sector in a meaningful way. If the private sector isn't communicating and trusting government and vice versa, then guess what? Your vocational training centers are training people for jobs that existed 10 or 20 years ago, because that's what their laboratory equipment or was set up to do. And it's not what the businesses need today. We try very hard to pull the private sector in, and not just as a philanthropist or a CSR, corporate social responsibility fashion, but to think about it as part of their business. And businessmen will tell you that they're not finding those young people with the double skills that Matthias talked about, the technical skills and the life skills. Well, how can they help in that? We're trying actually to develop, and we will over the next 6 months. Hopefully, inshallah, it will be a successful one, to have a test for life skills, so that you don't have to talk about this ethereal, subjective thing that might be a little squishy to some, might be more difficult to quiz a young person in life skills than it would be in trigonometry, or can you do an Excel spreadsheet to get a Microsoft certificate? But we're developing with the private sector and with professional testers, some graduates, if you will, from the ETS billion-dollar corporation that's made a lot of money in testing over the years, is to develop a test for life skills, so that training centers, public and private, employers could trust it, and a young person would put that on their bio, just like they would put, I did an internship, or I can do Excel, or I speak 3 languages. And we think that will have a play, and have a play to get to scalability. The size of the demographic, the largest cohort of teenagers in the history of the world. Now, some countries have a larger cohort than others. And it won't go away quickly in the MENA region or sub-Saharan Africa, that youth bulge. It will take another couple of generations, but it is both a huge opportunity for them. And some of them will migrate to other countries. And that can be okay if it's reasonable and not an avalanche of migration. We should know that in the United States. We ship $50 billion of foreign aid back to Latin America. It's called remittances. And those are poor, lower class, by and large, low income Latinos who are sending 10 times as much family aid that the United States sends in foreign aid to Latin America. So migration and jobs are a global issue. So we try very hard, but we're trying to get this, what people call today systems change. Enough pilot projects, or if the pilot project has worked, let's get on with scaling it. There's not time, and the demographics call for it. So I won't explain it, but Matthias and I and some others have been involved in a multi-stakeholder new platform, a community of practice, and an investment fund called Solutions for Youth Employment at the World Bank. Several big businesses, several big foundations, and some bilateral aid programs and a few NGOs have come together representing the 3 different... Yes, bringing together the 3 different sectors, business, government, and the third or independent sector, to try to get at the solutions that would be, now yes, it would be a different solution in one country or another, but what can you generalize and then scale so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and to come up with the policies and practices and proven practice programs such that you could get at a much faster, because it's more than training. It's going to take investment. It's going to take, the Arab world, I think, has the largest offshore investment of any region. Well, if they could bring some of that home. But if I were a Saudi or a Jordanian and I had my money in England, I'm not sure I'd bring it back if I didn't think I could put it to use and earn some money. So it's a whole series of things, but we have to be looking at, we talk about holistic youth development. There has to be holistic political and economic development, which takes many ministries and the private sector being involved too.
You talk about taking small projects to scale, not reinventing the wheel, which is what the minister mentioned earlier on. Matthias, tell us a little bit about how the World Bank is approaching this. I know you've worked on some very interesting projects, including this national service project in Lebanon, which is important because a lot of young people feel they're not connected to the idea of them as a citizen. So you need to establish those channels. And then I also want you to talk a little bit about the Adolescent Girl Initiative that you worked on in countries from Liberia to Jordan to Afghanistan, to teach those skills, vocational skills, to young women to transition from adolescence into full-time or employment, in essence. I mean, entering the job market. That's important. And I want to talk about gender as well in the Middle East and the very important role of women.
Thank you. Let me say one thing before I answer your question in response to something that Bill said. That no one has ever escaped poverty in a sustainable way without having a job. And generally those are jobs in the private sector, right? So we can't ignore the constraints facing the private sector when it comes to encourage investment and job creation. So the question that Jasmine raised about security and peace and stability, and that Bill raised about encouraging investment in these countries, this is not a trivial question. It's not an easy question, it's not a trivial question. So I think Bill is right that we have to think about how to encourage private investment in job creation in these environments. But let me get back to your question, and I apologize for the digression. One of the things that we are trying to do is to collect and synthesize the evidence for what works in actually getting young people into sustainable jobs. And when we started this endeavor a few years ago, we were dismayed to learn that actually the evidence was very, very weak. We have been working together with the ILO on something called the Youth Employment Inventory. And in that, that's a list, a collection of some 900, nearly 1,000 programs, projects dedicated to youth employment and youth employability. And when we've done a meta-analysis, when we've looked at that whole package, that whole pile of programs, it turns out that the evidence for the success of any model is very, very small. What seems to work best are programs that promote self-employment. What seems to work best in wage employment are programs that support the development of life skills and soft skills and that sort of thing. Less the technical vocational, the traditional model of technical and vocational skills. Those seem to be less effective. So one of the things that we're doing under the Solutions for Youth Employment initiative that Bill mentioned is that we're trying to build the evidence base and see what can we say in a systematic way? What are the programs that seem to be best suited to engendering employment, employability among young people in different environments? So we're trying to build the evidence base and bring this together. The Adolescent Girls Initiative was an effort in 8 countries to see what might work to get young women into employment, particularly. Young women face constraints that all young people, that young men face as well, and then some constraints that young men don't necessarily face. So we worked among other places, in Afghanistan, in Liberia, in Jordan, in Haiti, and the other countries you mentioned. And there we found that, again, not a lot works. It's very, very difficult to get young women into employment. We had success in Liberia, and I think that was partly because we started from a very low base. We had some successes in Jordan, not really sustainable. We had some success in Nepal, but particularly in the rural areas. So when we assembled the evidence, we were really dismayed to learn that it's very difficult to find, as Bill says, the magic bullet.
And what were some of the obstacles that you found? I assume a lot of them are social restrictions.
A lot of them are social for young women. The ability of young women to leave the house, to accept unemployment outside the house, that was clearly a constraint in some places. In other places, for the wage employment programs that we tried to implement, there simply weren't the jobs available. We trained people for jobs that didn't exist. And that, I'm afraid, is not uncommon. That happens in many technical vocational training programs.
Skills and
well, it's not just that there's a mismatch. It's that there aren't jobs at all. There aren't wage jobs at all. So we were, in fact, pushing on the worker side when the constraint was somewhere else. The entrepreneurship and self-employment programs that we've done have been much more successful. And that can run the gamut from technical training in carpentry or other kinds of small business and enterprise skills, business management skills, business development skills, access to finance, access to markets, and so on. So, in Afghanistan, clearly we had issues with the ability of young women to leave the house to seek employment outside. That was also a problem in some other places, but for surprising reasons. In Liberia, young women were constrained because they didn't want to go out at night, because there's no electric light, and they were afraid of being assaulted. The majority of the young women with whom we worked in Liberia had already been the victims of assault. And that was a constraint, that was a problem I hadn't anticipated. That was a complete surprise to me. I sort of naively didn't expect to see that. So young women face constraints that policymakers are unaware of. Right?
I think that's an issue on many levels.
Yeah.
Women face constraints that often policymakers are not aware of. I want to ask the minister about what it's like to be a woman minister in the UAE, how you've been received by your colleagues, not just as a young minister, but as a woman minister, and how your country approaches the empowerment of women.
I just want to let you guys know, maybe some of you may know, that a few days ago we had Emirati Women's Day. We celebrate the international one, but we also have our own Women's Day. Women, and our Prime Minister tweeted that Emirati women empower society. 2/3 of our government employees are women. 1/3 of our cabinet are women, and I don't think so. There's a lot of countries that have a lot of women, female ministers. Our country is just 45 years old, but I'm so proud of the achievements that we've achieved, and we still have a lot to go. The Emirates Mars mission is led by a 29-year-old Sara Al-Amiri, a female. It's beautiful to see how women in our culture are not only respected, but also empowered, given limitless opportunities, and we focus a lot on gender equality. It's not just women, but equal opportunities.
And when you've been listening to some of what our panelists have been saying, what strikes you as issues that you can think through and take back to the UAE, or potential avenues where the UAE could inspire aspects of what the region is going through?
And on your second point about inspiring aspect, Jasmine was talking about violence, and it made me think about changing mindsets. I think we always look at the Middle East region and say counter-violent extremism. But there's so many other youth. If we shift the focus on the role models, whether it's the tech startup entrepreneur in a village in Egypt, or the Emirati filmmakers in our media hub, these are the ones who the media should also focus on, because we were talking with William about the hope gap. And there's a hope gap when there are no role models. And so we need to highlight these achievers, and that's my 2 cents on it.
I think that's an issue very often with the US, and I'll quote my friend Bassem Nasser from your organization, Bill, who was telling me that very often in the US as well, but also in the region, people and policymakers look at the youth as a potential counter-terrorism or terrorism issue, as potential for violence, and everything, all the policies, particularly these days in Washington, increasingly so, I find everything is seen through the prism of counter-terrorism and how do we mollify youth, how do we make sure they don't become violent. And I think that you raise a fantastic point, that it's important also to highlight what is positive and the role models who are out there, because certainly when I travel back to the region, and I go back 3, 4, 5 times a year sometimes, there is a lot happening that is simply not being highlighted. But on that last point of countering violent extremism or counter-terrorism, I mean, it's not simply, the answer, the silver bullet, if there were to be one, isn't simply about creating jobs, is it? It has to be more than that, Bill, isn't it?
No, it is more than that. But there's a new report out saying, well, it's not about employment. Well, it isn't about employment if you're looking for one single answer. And we tend to look at these reports just like we do in the medical field. But there is a report out now put out by Mercy Corps, a wonderful organization. But the press has picked up on the fact that it said, well, it's really not about employment. It's about a lot of other stuff too. Well, the other stuff too we have to work on. But young people who are not employed are not going to be, the minister talks about disconnected or alienated or left out or gaps in society between youth and the future. That big gap, as Matthias said, sustainable development for a poor or low-income person is a job. And if you lose the job, you can go out and get another job. That's that grit and resilience and entrepreneurship that will get you from losing a job to getting a new one. Societies just won't be stable if young people don't have an income and a reason for being. The minister talked about the hope gap. The woman who coined that phrase for me is Her Majesty Queen Rania of Jordan, who was on our board of directors for a number of years. And we were talking one day with her about the digital gap. This was now 15 years ago. And she says, yeah, that's important. But I'm much more worried about a hope gap. And some of my staff were around and I knew what she was talking about, but I wanted her to put it into her own words. And the hope gap is not something ethereal or that Kumbaya will solve for you. It's a young person having the hope that if you stay in school and you work hard and you do well and you continuously learn about things, you will find that passion, that route in life, whether it's setting up your own business or working for someone else. And quite frankly, entrepreneurship is not going to be the solution for employment, particularly if it's all informal and small little businesses that don't really employ anyone but the founder of the business. That's important stuff. It's called entrepreneurship for survival. We need to get beyond survival economics. And the incubators and the accelerators and some of the things that they're doing in UAE, and Jordan has a good program, and we see some of these programs in the United States and Europe too, are very important to start new businesses. But young people have to have, be connected to society, and that is, and boy, the studies have shown it in Egypt. A 30-year-old man who can't find a job, can't get married then, can't have his own apartment. You can't get it without a job and can't have your own apartment. How do you get married? So what? Now, is he going to become a terrorist? No, I think the chances are but we see it, and it's not just about extremism in that part of the world. Gangs in Central America or gangs in Los Angeles are driven too by young people who have chosen this maybe for an income, maybe for status, maybe for something to do, maybe for a family, because that kid doesn't have a real nurturing family around him. So the extremism we're talking about isn't just in the Arab world around what everyone likes to talk about, and the press certainly does, but we can't blame it on the press. We have to deal with these things. We have disconnected, alienated youth in the greater Washington area, across the river in Anacostia. What hope do they have? If they don't see hope, why stay in school? Why work hard? Why play by the rules? And this is I think, a global issue, and we all have to be aware of it. And they're not easy answers, but we've got to be at it in a comprehensive, all sectors, all hands on deck, all different parts of governments, and it's not just federal government. We know it from our own country here. Probably a municipal government or state government can get a heck of a lot more done for peaceful communities than relying on Washington to solve a problem in Chicago or Los Angeles.
I think you make a great point. In the Arab world, which is where I grew up, we have a tendency to think that our problems are the worst and everything is the worst there, and we've gone through things that no one else has gone through, but actually, there are similar problems everywhere. And I think the comparison between, radical militants or young people who get drawn to radicalism in the Arab world and violent gangs in Latin America is a very apt one. And I think that's a different way of looking at
some of those gangs got postdoctoral training in Los Angeles before they were shipped home.
But Matthias, you want
to...
sorry.
Let me say a couple of things about violence. First, I took part in a focus group discussion many years ago where a young man who had joined a gang was asked, why did you join the gang? And he said, well, they gave me a pair of shoes. and obviously it wasn't about the shoes, right? The shoes were symbolic. It wasn't just the shoes, but it was a symbol of this hope gap that Bill and Her Excellency have referred to. But let me say something about violence. I've worked a lot in war zones, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. And even in the worst, in the depths of conflict, it is only a very small minority of people who are actively engaged in violence. Yes, young people and young men primarily predominate in violence, but it's only a small number of young people who are really engaged in violence. A few percent, maybe, if that, right? And most people are trying to get along. They're trying to survive. Some exceptionally heroic people are trying to build peace. They're actively engaging, trying to intervene in the conflict, but the vast majority of people are simply trying to survive. So it is, I think, unfortunate that we let a small number of people who admittedly cause an enormous amount of chaos, but it's unfortunate that we let that drive our concept and our policies and our thinking.
I think that's a fantastic point. Jasmine, do you want to add anything to that?
Just very quickly, because I completely agree with you. I wanted to add the issue of identity also, because I think that's just a huge issue, especially when it comes to youth populations in the region. The age of, I don't know, 12 to 18, you really are trying to figure out who you are and where you belong. And it is human nature to need to belong to something. People want to be part of a mission and a story and a community. And so trying to figure out, I think also, and often, by the way, that loss of identity or lack of identity leads to violent extremism. So that's, an important issue to address. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean finding that person a job or whatever. It could mean community service. It could mean projects that bring people together around a specific cause. Even if that cause is, I'll never forget, actually, it's in a few weeks after the revolution in Egypt when you saw people went to Tahrir Square and they were cleaning it up. And it was kind of like, it was just very impromptu. It wasn't run by the government or anything, but it was something that created a bond between people who felt like they had a shared interest in making something happen. So
I think a sense
identity.
of purpose is what drives everybody around the world, and I think we need to work on that in our region. But I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute. But I cannot have any conversation about the Arab world without mentioning Syria, because that is going to stay with us for a very long time. It's a whole lost generation, millions of children who are left outside of the educational system, whether they're inside Syria, whether they're refugees in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt as well. And I want to hear from each one of you if you have anything particular to say, but I want to start with you, Matthias, about, tell us a little bit about how the World Bank is looking at some of those issues. I know they're already to some extent looking at potential reconstruction of Syria, but how do you factor in this lost generation when you're working on projects in the Arab world?
We are trying right now to deliver services to those people who've been displaced, primarily outside Syria, it must be said, and that's a question for discussion about whether the bank should be engaged in Syria right now. But right now we're not, and we're engaged to provide services to the people who have fled. I think it's called Zatari in Jordan is the third largest city in Jordan. And we're now working with the local governments to try to enable people who live there, who aren't Jordanian, who don't have residence permits, to enable them to start businesses, because there are constraints that they face. You have to be a official Jordanian resident in order to start a business and to have access to finance locally and so on. So we're working with local policymakers to try to alleviate some of those constraints and provide opportunities for people to start businesses. In addition, we are also working with NGOs and others to provide services such as health and education, water, basic services to the people who are living there. This is also true in Turkey and in Lebanon and in some of the other countries in the region, where we're trying to keep those services active and running and to minimize the disruption, minimize the harm that is caused by that kind of disruption as much as we can.
But Bill and Jasmine, if you want to pitch in, and the Minister, if you have any thoughts on Syria. I mean, when we look at all these different elements of what we need to do to empower youth, to create jobs, to improve the education system, to match the skills with the job market, how does the issue of millions of Syrian children who are outside of this, I don't want to even call it current sort of effort, but because it's it's disparate. How does that weigh the whole region down, and how does the region then try to? Does everybody then pitch in to help them move forward as well? Jasmine.
I mean, yes. The answer is yes. Everybody should pitch in. I was last year. Early last year, was at Zaatari refugee camp, and I was talking to some of the kids who were acting, they were older kids, and they were acting as mentors to the younger kids in the camp. And we were just kind of asking them, like, what is it that you really need? Which seemed like such a ridiculous question because obviously they need a lot. But what is it that we can help with? What can we focus on? So on. And this one kid, I think maybe he was 17 or 18 years old. He just, he said it's, we need education. We need to learn. We want to learn. We're just sitting here, twiddling our thumbs, waiting for the moment when we can go back to our country, because presumably you all want us to go back to our country, right? I mean, the neighboring countries have done an incredible job in accepting and help and maintaining and housing these refugees, but it's not forever. I mean, this is supposed to be a temporary thing. So this young man said, he says, I feel like it's really unfair that 5 years from now, we're going to go back to Syria, and you all are going to expect us to rebuild that country. And what are we going to rebuild it with when we've spent the last 5 years? Where are the skills that we have? So I think this is where pitching in and utilizing internet. I mean, it's just something as simple as the internet. When it comes to education, whether it's mentoring kids via Skype, so it's investing in the infrastructure to allow things like Skype sessions and mentoring kids with English classes. I could see something where high schools across the U.S. Allow their students extra credit for having half-an-hour conversation with a Syrian refugee in English once a week. Just things like that. I mean, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts too on this, but what can we do to help from afar? Because obviously we can't go in, but doing nothing is not really an option, especially for the long-term prospects of the region.
Bill, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, wow. I fear that we'll be visiting camps in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, like we visit Palestinian camps in Jordan, and they call them still camps 50 years later. Rebuilding isn't just bricks and mortar. It's going to be putting a country back together, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I'll maybe extrapolate, though. I don't want to avoid Syria, but I'm not a Syria person. We've worked a lot in Jordan and Palestine and not in Syria. I was with a senior development professional in Europe recently who said the Syria migration is awful for Syrians, for their neighbors, and somewhat for Europe also. And he was even referring to the fact that now Swedish and Finnish and German foreign aid might be spent on foreigners in Germany and Sweden to take care of these. So it literally would subtract from other foreign aid that they're doing to take care of recent. And he took it then to the whole issue of the youth bulge, long-term sustainable inclusive economic development that brings young people into the economy and allows them to have a good life in the country they were born in. And I think most people want to stay in the country they were born in. And he said, Syria may look like a nice walk in the park 30 years from now when Nigeria has 400 million people. How will we keep out that many people in Europe? And this wasn't a European Donald Trump. This was a serious development professional that could have been one of the senior staffers at a World Bank. He said this issue of bringing young people into and having a place in the economy and society with a youth bulge like that, how countries handle that is not going to be just a country issue, it's going to be a global issue, because some of these migration flows are maybe rather small to what they could be 20 and 30 years from now, with other countries not handling or not able to maintain the people in their country.
Right. Minister Masroor, unless you have a last point you would like to make, we'll go to questions.
I just wanted to follow up on and add to what Jasmine said. I think it's very important that we can tap into technology to help everyone around us. It's our shared responsibility. And it's heartbreaking to see.
I try to end conversations on a positive note, but it is a difficult region. But I do think it is important to keep reminding people that this war is ongoing. It's been 5 years. It's not going away, and everybody needs to do more. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. There are microphones, lots of hands. I'll start over there, second row. If you could stand up, introduce yourself. If your question is addressed to someone specific on the panel, please let us know and keep it short so we can get lots of questions in.
I was just very struck by the conversation.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name's Mara Cronenfeld, also with the International Youth Foundation. I was very struck by the conversation on countering violent extremism and this lens with which we view the Middle East, having been back and forth for 15 years to Middle East and North Africa. And I think that we do really have to think about how in the US and in the Western world, how we view the region, and that exists in a dialect, that exists in a conversation. And there's a reaction to the conversation and the way people look at the Middle East and North Africa here. And so I think that just means I'm constantly struck by what I see in terms of images on TV and in the news and in the media that never, ever match what I see when I'm there. And so whatever we can do, and I've talked to the minister this morning, but whatever we can do to increase the positive images of those people who are making positive changes, and maybe flip this terminology from CVE to something like positive youth inclusion. Mm-hmm. You can't go in and help a young person by saying, are you a terrorist? Are you going to be one? And what's the M&E? What's the monitoring and evaluation look like? Did you blow up something today? Yes or no? So we have to flip the way we talk about this if there's going to be improvement. Thank you.
Nicely put.
That wasn't really a question.
Would you like to say something?
I didn't want to.
Jasmine, do you want to have some input here about how the U.S. views the region and how we can flip that? Because you and I know, I mean, we go to the region a lot, and we see the gap between how the region is portrayed here and what we encounter when we're in the actual region in our countries, when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to personal initiatives, when it comes to mentoring programs, when it comes to art. I recently wrote a piece about art in the Arab world, which did very well because people were somewhat surprised to see the level of creativity that you have, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or Beirut or Egypt. There is a lot of creativity, and I think you make a great point about the idea of positive inclusion rather than countering violent extremism. Because before you counter the extremism, perhaps you can prevent it, right?
Absolutely, and I that was a great article, by the way, because it also looked at it looked at these issues in a different way. I mean, you really do tend to look at the region, and you read the news, and it's always about war or terrorism or extremism and this and that, and then you actually go there, and yes, that stuff happens too, but it's not just what happens. It's not the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So I think. Yes, I agree, highlighting positive things that are happening in the region. It's something that's not so hard to do. And there are women-led initiatives, there are youth-led initiatives. I mean, there's very exciting...
female young ministers.
Just in the flesh, yes. There are very, very exciting things that are happening in the Middle East. And so I think that, whether it's documentaries or exchange programs, and they do exist, of course. I mean, the U.S. government has programs where they bring in people and they send people over there. There's the East-West Foundation in Egypt does exchange programs where they bring 10 youth from the U.S. and Egypt together for a couple of weeks, and they go around the country, both here and in Egypt. So things like that. Again, just to go back to this theme of how do you identify something positive and then scale it and fit it to different contexts around the region. And then the last point about this, it's not, countering violent extremism doesn't have to mean literally countering something. Like someone says this, you're going to say that. It's not a tit for tat thing, but it's more about, in my opinion, my humble opinion, providing an alternative narrative. Regardless of what's going on the terrorism front, let that happen. People will deal with it. There's security solutions, etc. But tell a different story and have people look to that story instead.
But beyond the story, it has to have, concrete.
Well, sure, the story is based on, of course, yes, absolutely. Things that
and
are
so
happening
when
on
it
the
comes to
ground.
flipping the image and making it positive, it's also about finding those initiatives that are worth feeding, that are worth funding to, empower those young people. Right here in the back, please.
Hi, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. When first about the Syrian refugees, a United Nations person was telling me that the internet has provided youth hope. It also provides families to connect with each other when there is a horrible situation. So I guess what's your Wi-Fi password is asked here at Atlantic Council and also at some of these refugee camps. My question about the UAE, I was in Dubai in the 90s, and I was forced to golf after noon because I'm a woman at the Emirates Golf Club. And I was talking to a State Department friend, and we were talking about integration. And I'm like, how do people integrate with business? Because women in the 70s and 80s fought to get on golf courses so we could integrate with men and become business leaders to break the glass ceiling. So are the youth talking about integrating with the leadership? And are women, can they golf now before noon? Because it's really hot there. Thank you.
There you go. I was going to say, I'm not sure golf is a priority for a lot of people, but there you go. The minister is a golfer. Tell us a little bit more. I mean, I know that this is a question that a lot of people ask in the U.S., but tell us more about how you empower young women to be part of public life in countries where there are still some of those barriers.
I want to go back to a lot of people, even when I used to study at the US, they see another image. I think the media shows you another image. I'm an example, maybe I'm a testament to that, but so many other of my sisters in the UAE have free education. They get equal opportunities as men. They get equal pay. And it's not I'm shocked that you mentioned about the golf issue. I'm a golfer and I've always been playing golf. So it's another kind of story that I think maybe a lot of you are not seeing, and I'm glad today I got the chance to share with you, because you should come visit the UAE and see them.
I was there. I was at the Emirates Golf Club in Dubai, and they told me I could only golf after 12 o'clock because women could not golf before 12 o'clock. And I just went
In the 1990s?
When was that? Never mind.
We have layers of issues that we need to work through in the Middle East. Over there, please, in the row in the middle. The gentleman with the glasses.
Hello, my name is Adam Hamzi. I'm a student at the University of Texas here for the semester. So we talked about how the Middle East isn't a monolith and how the situation with the youth varies across countries, but then also the youth themselves in these countries aren't monoliths either. Yep. Many of them have opportunities that some of the more impoverished youth don't have. So I'm wondering, how can we motivate the youth that have more opportunities and have access to more education? How can we motivate them to stay in those countries that they get the education in, rather than leaving and offering their services and their skills to maybe the United States or places in Europe? And how can we give motivation opportunities for them to stay here, or I guess stay in the Middle East, rather than, I guess, brain drain is the term that people use to describe that. So what work can be done to keep them in those countries? And to keep, I guess, facilitating those opportunities that they had that impoverished youth didn't have.
Who would like to take that on? Jasmine, do you want to give it a stab?
I mentioned this earlier, this issue of expats. In sort of polling a lot of my friends and contacts in the region and who have left, both who stayed in the region and left, who are Middle Eastern, this issue kept coming up again and again, this issue of how to prevent people from leaving, but also once they leave, how do you maintain ties with them so that even if you can't convince them to come back, you can still try to get them to, you can try to benefit from them in a way that is not just sending money back, although that is a very important thing, aspect of the economy, but how do you get them to contribute? Again, one of my friends, he's Lebanese. He started this. It's a new model, but it's called the Lebanese Oil and Gas Initiative, and it's an NGO that basically harnesses the expertise and education of Lebanese expats in the oil and gas industry around the world to provide advice, to provide mentorship, to help the Lebanese inside Lebanon to deal with issues related to oil and gas. So I thought that was quite an interesting model of getting people involved in a way where they feel like even if you can't go back now, because to tell the truth, I mean, it is very difficult to leave a country like Egypt or any other country in the Middle East, not to just talk about Egypt, and then to go back and be faced with the same problems that were there when you left, except that now they seem so much more unmanageable because you've seen, you know, how things are when you don't have these problems. I mean, even things, I mean, you can talk about corruption and you can talk about this wasta, you have to know someone in order to get something done. But even things like traffic jams and things like, it's just not easy to be a working professional in the Middle East.
But he raises a good question about how do you bridge the income and opportunity gap, right? The disparity that people have to deal with in the U.S. As well. How do you help people feel included, even at the different ends of the income and opportunity spectrum?
Well, I think partly, I think we should ask the question: why is it that people want to leave? Right. So, what are the problems that you faced that encouraged you or made you decide to come to the U.S. to study? And clearly, you're not unique, right? I mean, you are in many ways, of course, but not in that. that there are many people who face the same sets of decisions and constraints that you face, and who've made the decisions that you've made. So I think to take a step back and say, right, why am I here and not there? What would it take for me to go back? I think making laws and preventing people from moving is not really the right way to do it. I think it's rather addressing some of the constraints that Jasmine just discussed, the WASTA and whatever, that prevent young people from having access to the opportunities that they would like to have in their homes. And I think that also goes some way to addressing the concerns about the sort of insider-outsider, rural, urban, less educated, more educated. Clearly, those issues need to be dealt with, confronted head-on to expand the opportunities available domestically.
The UN had a program in the 90s with Lebanon. I don't know whether it was just Lebanon, but possibly in other countries as well, that was called Talk 10, the transfer of knowledge through expatriate nationals, through which they encouraged nationals with expertise who were around the world to come back to Lebanon with a specific program on almost like an exchange program to contribute back to their country for a year or 6 months, facilitated by the UN, work in ministries or the private sector to share the knowledge that they had gained while working abroad. So I'm curious if that program is still there, but it's certainly something that they should consider. I'm just going to go to the front here, please.
Yara Asad, consultant with Wolfenson and Company. My question goes back a bit to the idea of Palestinians staying in camps, and we're afraid that whoever today, unfortunately, it's the Syrians, but then it could be many others. And it takes me more to the idea of inclusion in the Arab world. How much are we really looking at an opportunity from the Syrian youth today in Jordan or in Egypt or wherever they are to actually help boom more of the economy, bring them in, include them, rather than just, and I don't know how much we're bringing that into the question.
Bill, do you work on any programs with Syrian refugees in the region?
We haven't yet, and I must say the relief community, now I'm going to make a generalization, relief situations, refugee situations historically have not gotten into employment and entrepreneurship because they're expecting those people or wanting those people to leave and get out and go home.
Even though the average year that
I understand.
of a refugee life today is 17 years.
No, I understand, but I think our international development and rescue relief community is beginning to struggle with that, and because they're not used to dealing with those issues. And then there's some host governments that don't want to see that kind of investment taking place because they're afraid that it will displace their own people. So it's a complicated issue. But yes, if you're going to be there 5-10 years, a 15-year-old is going to be 20. Do you want the 20-year-old to be sitting around with nothing to do and dependent on foreign aid then? No. So
that's the attitude of a lot of governments. Matthias, do you want to say anything about how the World Bank is approaching that? Because I think there are some there is some effort to try to have Syrian economic zones or on the border in Jordan to have some kind of job opportunities for Syrian refugees. I know it was at the very beginning stages when I heard about it.
Right, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're working with some local government and local administrators to try to open up opportunities for people living in these camps, and trying to structure this in such a way that it doesn't feel threatening to the host community.
There can be a contribution.
To emphasize the contribution, to emphasize the fact that it's not, to use the jargon, a zero-sum game. If a Syrian refugee creates a job as an entrepreneur, it doesn't take a job away from someone else, right? To emphasize this notion of additionality and inclusion and growth.
Okay. Question in the back, the gentleman with the glasses.
Thank you. Thank you. Mohammed Abdul-Kadim with the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you for being here, everyone. I have two quick questions for the minister. The first is related to parent engagement. We've often found that sometimes parents can unintentionally become barriers for progress. Maybe they're worried about their child getting a passport and going overseas, or in the case of the Middle East, they may have preferences on the child's major. Curious, first of all, if you have had any sort of targeted outreach to parents and grandparents to help remove them as barriers, get them to support some of your initiatives. The second is regards to curricular reforms, or just thinking about changing sort of from rote memorization to the integration of critical thinking, analysis, global learning. What types of reforms have you put in place to think about that shift in the P220 pipeline?
Thank you for your question. So we launched a few weeks ago a national values program, and this values program focuses on, we were talking about purpose, and it's all about identity and who we are as Emirati youth. What do we stand for, and what do we live for? It's again to give people something to live for and to belong and to connect, and it's an intergenerational conversation. So you can't just instill values on people. You need to ask them what are the values that they care about, and it's also with parents and grandparents to know more about Emirati values and how can we make sure that all Emirati youth are grounded in Emirati traditions, values, and customs. So that program is a lot with parent engagement and elders.
And tell us about your personal experience and your relationship with your parents, if I may ask you, because that is important. I mean, I know that growing up as a woman in Lebanon, it had never occurred to me that there was something I couldn't do because I was a woman, because my father never brought it up. And that is very important.
I have the same experience, and in fact, my parents are my mentors who taught me to live for something that's bigger and better than myself. And I think that goes back to the purpose, that you're redefining success, and success is about giving back to not only your community or your nation or country, but to the world. And I think that's the highest measure of success, to think about the bigger picture, and about your role and identity, and what moral obligation do you have to the people around you, no matter what faith they follow.
We have time for one last question. The gentleman in the back, also with microphone is coming to you. I think this will have to be our last question.
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector advisor. I'm of the private sector, and I apologize. I have no patience. I try to.
You want the solutions right now?
Yes. So I have the solution, and here it is.
Great. We're going to end on this
I'm taking notes.
Invoke the Morrill Act of 1862 in the United States and create a series of land-grant universities which develop research, and use it as a basis for invoking an investment program to emulate Silicon Valley, where you bring in innovative, disruptive, cutting-edge research. You want to keep this young man in the country? You want to bring everybody back in from the diaspora? Create these opportunities and use the capital markets to do it. And one other thing, you got a basic problem that you haven't talked about at all, and that is land rights. The Emirates is a private real estate holding, and companies that want to have a secure, long-range future have to have the security of knowing that the land on which they build their businesses is irrevocable. If you can overcome that problem and use research and education and innovation, I think you got the problem solved. You're welcome. Thanks.
Well,
thank you.
Well, I think this goes to you know, the idea that there are these, small-scale solutions and problems, and the big-scale solutions and big-scale problems, and how you marry the two. I think your idea is fantastic. I'm just worried that governments in the region aren't quite able to look at that sort of grand scale.
Governments have to be able to do more than one thing at a time. They have to be able to prioritize and to do the rest. It'll be a cascade.
The silver bullet that we've all been looking for. Would you be willing to ask a question, or do you have any points that you'd like to make, Madam Minister?
Thank you. Actually, it has been a really interesting conversation, especially hearing about the context of the region and what can be accomplished. And then going back, it's at the end of the day, we were all looking at the youth as an importance, and we share the same goals, all of us, whether we're based in DC or based in the UAE. And I think that is also something that encourages us to do better and to collaborate as well. I mean, my question is, everyone asks great questions, but most importantly is maybe, let's say, from now and 2 years ahead, where will be the Arab world? Where will be the UAE? And yes, I agree with Jasmine. The UAE is a model of, from a population perspective, and a model is something that is, luckily, I don't want to sound biased, but it is a model that aspires a lot of people. Yet for us, when she mentions what's happening in Egypt with the rise-ups, we work closely with them. Those are the people we talk to. Yes, I am a government official, but again, at the same time, when we talk to the youth and when we talk to to organizations that look into them, we don't focus just about the government and the policy, but we focus on those grassroots community members that can bring hope and aspire. And then going back to the example, I don't have a question, but again, I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think this brings us to the end of our conversation. I would like to thank in particular Her Excellency the Minister for joining us for this conversation, and all our panelists, Bill, Jasmine, and Matthias. Thank you very much for a conversation. I think we tried to address some of the problems and find some of the solutions, but mostly I think we leave you with a slightly more positive impression of what young people in the Arab world can actually offer. We're not just a burden, but I think we're certainly full of potential. So thank you very much. A round of applause for our panelists, and thank you for hosting this conversation.
Very nice to meet you.
Great fun. That was good.